This lesson we're going to be covering outputting more complex JSON data onto the page. So we've got a JSON file that we're going to be requesting using our JavaScript, and this file is JSON data is a collection of an array, and then within that array, a couple items that are objects. Within those objects, we also have arrays, another set of arrays, and then also some objects that are nested within it. Objects, arrays that are nested within each other, where we want to extract the values and have all of the values show up on the page in this type of format where we're just looking at the values. Here is we've combined the first and last names together in order to output the values function that's outputting that content onto the page. And we're going to be exploring some options that you have with JavaScript in order to accomplish this. So it's all coming up in this lesson. We've got a basic HTML file. We're going to link to our JavaScript code, and then that JavaScript code is going to request a JSON content from a JSON file that's also going to be located on the same directory. So we're going to be using the script source, linking to a script file, and I'll give the script file a name of app12.js. And let's create the JSON file and the app12.js file on the same directory as we've got our HTML file. And I've created a JavaScript file called app12.js and a file called data12.js that we can use in order to get the JSON data and then return that content back to our web application. So we do have one element on the page, and that's going to be the element with the class of output. So let's select that object into our JavaScript code. So using the document and then query selector, selecting the element with a class of output so that we can use it as an object within our content. I'll open up the code inspector within the browser window. So I'm using Chrome, and that's opened here on the right hand side. So we can see the browser at the top, the console in the bottom right, and the code that we're writing in the left hand side within the code editor. So let's add some content. So doing text content, we'll just add some content to the output area that will say click me. And then within that output area, actually we're going to create a separate element, and this can be a button that will be clickable, and we'll add the button using the create element, and that will just create a button. And then for the button, we'll add the text content click me, so that we also have a main container that we're going to be using output for, and we can output additional content into that. Let's select the output element and append the button that we've just created. So that way we've got a button on the screen and we still have the output content area still available. Let's create one more. And we can just call this results, and using the document, create element, and here we can create a div. And the same way that we appended the button to output, we'll append the results object to the output. And then within the results, we can add in some text content and have the text content just say message for now. And we'll populate that content afterwards. So we've got a button. Let's make the button, add an event listener to the button. And the event listener is going to be listening for a click event. And once it gets clicked, then we're going to make the request. We'll make the fetch request and load the data from the JSON and load that into the results area that we just created. So let's set up our URL, and the URL is going to be just connecting to the JSON file on the same directory. So it's going to be where our source data is going to be sitting. And using the JavaScript fetch method, we're going to fetch to the URL and return that content back. So this is going to be as a response object, and that response object is going to be returned back as JSON, so we can pick it up within the next part of the request and then return back the data contents of that request. And we'll log that into the console. Once we have it, then we can plan out how we can output it on the page. So once the content is saved, go over to the browser window. I'll make it larger so that we can see the button better, and click it. And looks like there's an error with the JSON, and that's because we don't have any content yet within the file. So let's add in some content within there. We'll just create an array within the JSON, and within that array we can contain some additional information within the JSON object. And this should also be an object format. So that sets us up to have an array of items here. So we've got the first one, this could be people, and I'll just do the indentation so it's a little bit easier to read. So when we hit the click, that's going to return back the object data within this type of structure. And contained within people, we can have another array of people's names, and I'll wrap this within an object as well. So we can have a fairly deep structure of names and have another array, and then set up the first name, and we'll duplicate this structure so that we have multiple entries. So let's take a look at what we've got. So we've got an array, so there's two objects within the array. Within that first item, there's another array which is called people, and we can access it. And then within the people, there's another array, and that's got names, which is going to create a list of names that we can use. So let's set up another person here. And you can add, of course, as many items within the arrays as needed. So this is just an example of how we can have a more complex structure of objects. And there could also be another object here that can be cities. And maybe this is just an array of cities. And you could list out the content from the cities array. So let's take a look at what we've got now. So we've got people, so we've got names, we've got cities. So this is an array. We've got some items in there. And within the people, let's set up another item here within the object. And we'll call that country. So now we've got two items within the main array. So that's people and country. And then we can go down and select values from any one of these. This is in order to demonstrate more complex type structures within JSON data. So now let's output some of that content and output it onto the page. So going back into where we've got the data that's being output, we want to return back the people, and then within the people we want to see the different objects because each one of those objects has an array. So we need to find a more consistent type structure. So we've got the names and we've got cities here, and these are arrays as well. So as we select this content, let's start outputting it onto the page. We'll update the content of results. So this will say loading while it's loading the content. And then once it retrieves the content, then we can update the text area result. So at this point, we've got content there, so we can clear it out, or we can just note it as results, and then add to the page content. And I'll actually set this as inner HTML, so we can have some HTML content in there. So this will output some of the results that we've got for the page. And I'll create a function to handle the add to page. And this is going to be expecting an array as an argument and looping through each one of the items and then adding that to the results. So first we'll create a div and document, create element, and the element that we're creating is going to be a div. So we can have this added to the output area, and then the results append, and this is going to be appending the newly created div. And then within the div, we can have text content and set the text content to the item value. And usually I do like to wrap it with a second rounded bracket. So now we've got the add to page. Let's click the button and find where we've got the array. So within the country, we have an array. So let's add those to the page. So the array is actually going to be for the country. So in order to return that, we've got data, and using the index value of 1, that's going to select this object. And then within here, we've got a value of country. So that will navigate us down to the array, and let's see if it works. So we're able to output those results on the page. Let's find our next array. So we do have within index 1, we have people. Within people, there's another array of names and cities. And then within cities, we've got an array. So let's add the cities to the page. So selecting the data 0 with the index value of 0. And we have an object that has a name of people. And within that people, we have an array. So people is an array. We want to return back the second item, which is going to be index value of 1. And then going down the last level, we need to return back the cities. So that's going to be the array that we're after. So we're outputting the cities onto the page. We've got the countries onto the page. So now the next challenge is to output the names. So within people, let's take a look at the structure for the names. So the unfortunate thing is that we do have a names array, but this contains objects. So the structure is going to be slightly different. So we're not going to be able to use the same add to page. We're going to have to make some adjustments to this because this isn't going to fit nicely into the add to page. So if we were to try to add to page, so this is under people with the index value of 1 and the array names, see what gets returned back. We get this type of output because it's outputting the object. So we're not actually outputting the collect result. So if I output just names into the console, I'm going to see what we've got within the console and then plan out how to better output that content. So we do have an array, but the array contains objects, and then those objects have property values. So we need to construct it that add object page. And so this will be an array. And we know that within this structure, instead of the items, as we loop through them, we need to account that they're going to be object values. So we've got for each, we can create the div, we can append the div to the results, but these results, these items here in the console, they're still going to be within an object format. So we want to extract the object property, the name, as well as the value for that. So let's set this to be output to the page. And when we look at it, output to the console, so we've got this type of structure. So we want to get the properties of the object, and the object is actually going to be the item. So with JavaScript, we can turn the object into an array and just getting the values of the keys. So taking the object and getting the keys from it, we need to specify the object name, and that's going to be item. And now let's log out what we've got for the values. So that's going to give us all of the keys that we have. So we've only got the 2, so first and last. It's added it into an array structure. So we can now select those values from the array, and we can loop through those. So let's take vals, since this is now an array, and use the for each, and we can loop through each one of those values. And these are actually going to be the keys, so maybe we can just call it keys. I'll call it key value. So it's going to be the key value within the object. We also have an option with ES 2017 to get values. So instead of the keys, we can return back the values. Let's take a look at what we've got there. So that's going to return back the values instead of the keys. And in this particular case, we know we've got a first name and a last name. So in order to construct a name out of that, we can simply, if we wanted to, we could do a join, since now it's within an array. And that would join the results together, creating a full name. or if we want to use the values themselves, so this isn't going to be key value, it's just going to be the value. So we can loop through and return back both of those values and join them together as well if we wanted to. So we've got a few options here on how to manage this type of content. So the values are going to be the Jane Doe, the Laurence, Svekis, and then the combined values with the join is just being output here. So you can also string this together, and if you wanted to, you could get the full name by using the object values and join with the spacing. So once it gets converted into an array, then you're able to use the array method. So this way you can return back the full name of the item, as we know that this is the structure that we're looking for. So we see here it's returning back the full name, there it's returning back the full name. So that can just be all done within the one line of code. So let's do a combination of what we've got outputting here. So they're all going to be arrays that we're adding in, but if we detect that the content inside is an object, then we don't want to output it onto the page. We still need to create the element, but we want to output the full name results onto the page. So adding in a check here to see if type of item, and actually first what we can do is we'll output it into the console log. So we've got the type of the item into the console, and we see that it's being returned back as a string. So if type of item is not equal to, or it's equal to object, and that's returning back a string value there, then we'll console log out object. Else, actually for right now, we can just leave it as console and logging it out as an object. So let's update this back to add to page as the function. And we're getting the results there as object. And we'll just double check to make sure that type of is not string. So that's outputting it as object. So we get the object result there. So that means that we need to check, and we can output the actual type of the value. So see, we're getting it back as an object. And this should actually be lowercase string. So now we're returning back only the object. So we can do if it's an object, or we could check to see if it's a string. So either one will work. And if it is an object, then what we want to do is we want to get the object values and join them together to create the full name, which would be the value. So selecting the object values, just like what we did up there. And let's console log the full name and see if that works. And then we have the value, the string value that we want to output to the page, which is going to be the full name. So we're getting that full name value there. So what we want to do is we want to select and output the result for the item. So let's create a temporary value. And this will be whatever we've got for item. The output is going to be the temporary. And over here is where we're going to update and reset the value of temp is going to be equal to the full name. So at this point, we should be outputting the full names. So just as we did with the other data. So what this did is essentially this allowed us to condense some of the code and save us from creating a separate function in order to manage that. And of course, it depends on your JSON structure, but this is one way that you could handle this more complex JSON structure and outputting the content onto the page.